Hi guys, so here we are in our next section of notes. This is section 7.2 through 7.4, complex patterns of inheritance and pedigrees. Now last week we talked about Mendel and Mendel's rules. We called the stuff that we studied last week Mendelian genetics because it followed the rules and the principles that Mendel came up with. This week we are going to be learning about things that do not follow Mendel's rules. So we call this non-Mendelian genetics. So some of our key concepts, we've got phenotype. Remember, phenotype is your physical characteristics is affected by many different factors, and a combination of methods is used to study human genetics. New vocabulary, we've got incomplete dominance, multiple alleles, codominant alleles, polygenic traits, sex-linked genes, genetic disorder, carrier, pedigree, and epistatic gene. Central question, what are some exceptions to Mendel's principles? So everything that we're going to learn this week, codominance, incomplete dominance, things like that, do not follow the rules that we learned last week when talking about Mendel and Mendelian genetics. So your phenotype can depend on an interaction of alleles, okay? So on a chromosome, you have multiple genes, many genes. And sometimes these genes interact, and these different forms of genes interact where the alleles are not completely dominant over the other. And so what will happen is we actually see a blending or a mixing of the two genes, okay? So if you look at my fish down there below, I've got a nice green fish, I've got a nice blue fish on the left and the right, and in the middle we've got kind of like a mixing of the two genes. That's incomplete dominance. Remember, last week we learned that some genes were dominant, some were recessive. Well, now we're going to talk about some other ways these interact. Now, there are some genes that have more than two forms in a population. Like last week we were just talking about either you have this form or this form, only two forms. Well, as we know, that doesn't usually work out. Like if you think about eye color gene, how many different eye colors can you have within a population? Well, there's many different eye colors. Or blood type. What are the possible blood types? You could be A, you can be B, or you could be O, or you could be A and B. So there's multiple alleles, multiple versions of the gene. And if you have codominance, both will be expressed equally, okay? So in codominant, alleles are neither dominant or recessive, they're both expressed equally. So you can think about the blood type like you have A blood type, you have B blood type, you have O blood type, and then you have A, B. Well, in AB, they're codominant, they're both expressed equally. So the ABO blood types result in codominant alleles. Now, normally many different genes can interact to produce one trait. Well, one thing that we didn't get into last week, we talked about either you'd have brown eyes or blue eyes. Well, in actuality, eye color is called a polygenic trait. It's produced by the interaction of many different genes. That's why there's so many different shades of eye color. We also have sex-linked genes, the sex chromosomes. Remember the X and the Y. If you have an X and an X, you're female. If you have an X and a Y, you're male. They also carry some genes on them, and genes for other than just determining your sex. And so sometimes there's disorders associated with these that are called sex-linked genes or sex-linked disorders. So a sex-linked gene is located on either the X or the Y chromosome. Now, females can carry sex-linked genetic disorders. We say carry because they have two copies of an X for being female. So they might carry a copy and they may not express the disorder. We'll go into this more in detail. I've got some videos and things that we're going to do looking at sex-linked disorders later on this week. But males, if you have an X and a Y, you only have one copy of an X gene. So if you have a disorder associated with that X gene, you will always show it. An expression of the disorder depends on which parent carries the allele and the sex of the child. Now, traits that are not expressed equally in both sexes are commonly sex-linked traits. One super common one is color blindness. Colorblind, there's a lot of different males that have color blindness. Females, not so much. They might be carriers because they carry one copy of the gene, but they have one normal X, which does not have that gene, so they don't show that they have color blindness. They're called a carrier. This is just a picture of different disorders associated with the X and the Y chromosomes. So a genetic disorder is a disease or disorder that can be inherited. And if a family has a history of genetic disorder, the parents may want to know if their child could inherit this disorder. Now, some parents, like we just talked about, are known as carriers. And carriers have the recessive gene, the recessive allele for the disorder, but never show the symptoms because it's recessive. They have a good copy to cover up the copy that has the disorder. But carriers can pass that allele, that version, on to their babies. And we're going to go through and work through some Punnett squares showing this process. Now, in order to understand genetic disorders, a lot of times doctors will use a thing called a pedigree. A pedigree is basically a family tree that shows how different genes are passed on from generation to generation. So you can see here, I've got just a brief description on how this works, right? So the squares represent males and the circles represent females. Anytime they are connected with horizontal lines, that's showing a marriage or parents. The ones that drop below vertical lines connect the parents to their offspring. And you can see there's different shading on these. Now we're going to follow different traits, and we're going to get more into this on later on this week when we watch a video and do a handout about pedigrees. So pedigree is a chart for tracing genes in a family. Now phenotypes are used to infer or guess the genotypes on a pedigree. So if we look at the physical characteristics, we can determine the genes based on this. Autosomal genes show different patterns of inheritance on a pedigree than sex-linked genes. Remember, autosomal genes were the ones that code for all of your traits. The sex-linked genes were the X and the Y chromosome only. So there's another pedigree. And again, we're going to go into this more in detail later on this week. If the phenotype is more common in males, the gene is most likely sex-linked associated with the X chromosome. And again, that'll be important for us later in this week. An epistatic gene is something that can interfere and block other genes. Now, this little hedgehog here, he's an albino. And an epistatic gene, albinism, the gene for albinism or being an albino, is an epistatic gene. It actually blocks the coloration genes. All right, so here we are on our last slide. So the environment also interacts with genotypes. So your phenotype, what you physically look like, is a combination of your genes and your environment. And there's some organisms, like a lot of reptiles, their sex is dependent on the environment. It really is dependent on the temperature that their eggs are at during the time that they spend in the eggs. The higher the temperature, different sex they'll be. The lower the temperature, the different sex they'll be. Height in humans is also a phenotype affected by the environment. You might have genes that say you're supposed to be very, very tall, but if you never drink a lot of milk or have calcium or enough nutrients in your diet, you're never going to be as tall as your genes say you will. So there is some environmental interaction with your genotype. Now again, I quickly went through a lot of these topics. We are going to be covering all of these topics independently, so like incomplete dominance, codominance, polygenic traits, multiple alleles, this week with further videos and handouts. Okay, let me know if you have any questions.